Racist officer beats a black homeless man, thinking he's just another forgotten soul on the street. He taunts him, believing the man doesn't have the power to fight back. But what happens next will completely change everything. As the officer continues his cruel attack, mocking the man's appearance and station in life, the crowd stands still in shock. Everyone assumes this is just another routine encounter between an officer and a homeless person. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the officer couldn't be more wrong. What if this homeless man isn't who he appears to be? What if the person you're humiliating has a secret that would shatter your world? You won't believe who this man truly is, and what happens when the officer finally realizes his mistake. Stay tuned, because what's coming next will not only change the course of the officer's life, but will leave you questioning everything about power, privilege, and respect. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Racist officer beats a homeless black man, thinking he's just another nobody on the street, until he learns the shocking truth about who he really is. The officer stood over the man, feeling proud of what he'd just done. The homeless black man was bruised and lying on the ground. The officer believed he had controlled the situation, teaching the man a lesson. "You won't be causing trouble anymore," the officer muttered, turning away. But the man didn't stay down for long. Slowly, he began to get back up, despite the pain. His movements were slow, but there was something about him that caught the officer's attention. The man's eyes were sharp, focused. "Are you crazy?" the officer snapped, turning back to see the man standing. "I told you to stay down." The homeless man didn't respond. He just kept looking at the officer. There was something different about him that made the officer uneasy. He wasn't like the others the officer had dealt with before. This man had a presence that the officer couldn't ignore. "What's wrong with you?" the officer asked, his voice trembling a bit now. "I said stay down." But the man stood firm, and then, in a calm voice, he asked, "Do you know who I am?" The officer froze. He hadn't expected this. The homeless man wasn't some random person on the street. He was a medal-winning general, someone who had earned respect, not just from the military, but from everyone who knew him. The officer's smug expression remained as he stood over the homeless man, who was still crouched on the cold pavement, bruised and confused. The street was busy with people passing by, but no one dared to intervene. This was a routine situation for the officer. But something about this homeless man was different. The man had yet to speak a word as the officer's boot pressed against his side, knocking the air from his lungs. The officer stepped back slightly, looking down at the man in front of him. "What do you think you're doing here?" he spat. His voice oozed with contempt. The homeless man remained silent for a moment, eyes closed, trying to collect himself. He slowly lifted his head, meeting the officer's gaze with calmness that seemed out of place. It was almost as if the beating had not shaken him in the slightest. "I asked you a question," the officer barked, his tone growing impatient. But still, the homeless man didn't flinch. He merely stared at the officer with quiet intensity. The man's face was weathered, his clothes torn, but his eyes, those eyes were different. There was a deep wisdom there, a hidden strength. The officer, trying to regain control of the situation, pressed further. "Don't you have anything to say for yourself?" he growled. The homeless man looked up, and for the first time his voice came out steady, clear, and unwavering. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. The officer, puzzled by the question, scoffed. "Who cares who you are? You're nothing but a nuisance." The homeless man didn't react to the officer's insult. Instead, he calmly began to stand up. His body moved slowly, with purpose, as if every movement was deliberate. The officer watched, confused, unsure of what was happening. His hand instinctively rested near his sidearm, unsure whether this man posed any threat. "No, I mean really. Do you know who I am?" The homeless man repeated, his voice still calm but carrying an air of authority. The officer raised an eyebrow. This man had clearly lost his mind. He was clearly out of touch with reality, wasn't he? But then, something in the homeless man's posture made the officer pause. He wasn't cowering, wasn't begging for mercy like others had. Instead, the man stood up straight and, with steady hands, pulled out a military ID from his jacket pocket. The officer's eyes widened as he saw the ID. The card was well worn, and it clearly showed the man's name, rank, and a long list of commendations. The words "Medal of Honor recipient" glared up at the officer. The officer's face drained of color as the realization hit him. He had just assaulted a war hero, someone who had earned the highest honors this country could bestow. "I'm a general in the United States Army," the man said simply. His tone was even, and there was no anger, no bitterness. It was as if he had known, deep down, that this moment would come, that someone would someday make a mistake in underestimating him. The officer stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. The man he had just brutalized was no ordinary homeless person. He was a highly decorated general, a veteran who had served his country with honor. And here he was, standing before him in the street, revealing his true identity. The officer's mind raced. How had he not seen it before? He had judged this man solely on his appearance, assuming he was nothing more than a homeless person, a person without value. But he was so wrong. And now there would be consequences. The officer stood motionless, still reeling from the shock of seeing the general's military ID. He had just hurt someone who had earned the highest honors his country could offer. His mind raced. But before he could gather his thoughts, the general spoke again, this time with a firm but calm tone. "You're not the first to underestimate me because of what you see on the outside," the general said, his voice carrying an air of authority. "But let me tell you something, officer. What you did today, that's going to come with consequences." The officer felt a lump in his throat. He had been so blinded by his prejudices, his assumption that all homeless people were worthless, that he had failed to see the truth in front of him. Now, standing face to face with the man he had just attacked, he couldn't shake the feeling of regret. The general's words weighed heavily on him, and for the first time, he realized the depth of his mistake. "You've made a big mistake," the general continued, his eyes steady. "You've not just hurt me. You've hurt everything I stand for. You've hurt the men and women I've fought beside, those who've given everything for this country." The officer could only nod weakly, unable to form words. His pride had been shattered, and now he was faced with the truth of his own wrongdoing. But it wasn't just his actions that worried him now. He knew that the general wasn't alone. As the general finished speaking, he calmly tucked the military ID back into his jacket and took a deep breath, preparing for what was coming next. The officer was still processing everything, trying to make sense of the situation, when suddenly the sound of sirens filled the air. They were getting louder, approaching fast. The officer's face paled. He looked nervously at the general, then back at the street, where he could see several police cars speeding down the road. The officers inside were no doubt coming to investigate the incident, to see what had happened. And soon they would know what he had done. The officer's heart pounded in his chest. But it wasn't just any police officers in those cars. As they pulled up to the curb and the doors swung open, the officer saw someone step out of the lead car who made his stomach drop. His superior officer, the captain. But that wasn't what caught the officer's attention. Behind the captain was another figure, One he didn't expect to see, standing tall and proud. His eyes widened as he realized who it was, the general's younger brother. This wasn't just any man. This was an FBI agent, someone who had the power to expose everything, and that FBI agent was looking directly at the officer, his eyes cold with fury. "Do you realize the mistake you've just made?" the FBI agent asked, his voice low, dangerous. His tone left no room for excuses. The officer felt his knees go weak as he turned to look at the general, whose calm demeanor had suddenly shifted into one of quiet resolve. The general knew exactly what was coming next, and it wasn't going to be good for the officer. The officer's mind raced again. He had no idea how deep this went, but he was about to find out. The FBI agent stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. The officer could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him from all sides. This wasn't just about his actions anymore. It was about the consequences of hurting the wrong person. The officer stood there, frozen in place, his body shaking from the realization of what he had just done. The FBI agent, General's brother, approached him slowly, each step echoing in the tense silence. The officer's hands were still trembling, unable to move as he watched the powerful agent walk toward him. His mind raced. He had made a huge mistake, and now he was facing the consequences. "You don't even realize what you've done, do you?" The FBI agent's voice was steady, calm, and filled with authority. The officer could barely look him in the eyes, feeling smaller by the second. The general, who had been standing silently, finally spoke again. His words carried weight, each syllable a reminder of everything he had accomplished and everything the officer had just destroyed in an instant. "This is about more than just one wrong act, officer," the general said. "This is about the trust you've broken in this very system, a system that I fought for my entire life." The officer's mind was a whirlwind, his thoughts scattered, as he tried to process everything happening. His heart raced, his palms sweaty, as he now realized just how deep the hole he had dug for himself had become. He had targeted the wrong man, not just any man, but someone whose family had dedicated their lives to serving the country. The FBI agent, still glaring at the officer, addressed him once more. "You attacked a hero today. You broke the law, and now you will face the consequences." As the officer stood motionless, the general turned his gaze toward the approaching police vehicles. More officers were arriving at the scene, but the tension in the air was so thick that it felt like time had stopped. The officer's fate was already sealed, and everyone knew it. "I don't want to press charges against you, officer," the general said, his voice surprisingly calm considering what had just occurred. "But you will have to answer for this. You can't just go around hurting people, no matter who they are or where they come from." The officer swallowed hard, his body still stiff with the realization of his mistake. "I didn't know," he started, but the general cut him off, his voice growing more firm. "Does it matter now?" The general's words hit the officer like a slap in the face. There was no turning back from this, no way to undo the harm he had caused. The officer stood there, ashamed, unable to make excuses. The truth was clear. He had misjudged the man in front of him, and now he was about to pay the price. The FBI agent stepped forward, his face stern as he spoke to the officer with finality. "You're done here. This is bigger than you, bigger than your mistakes. You will answer for this." The officer's heart sank as the realization hit him like a wave. His life, his career, everything he had known was crashing down around him, and there was no escape from it. The officer stood still, shocked by what was happening. He had just attacked a man he thought was a nobody, a person he could easily control. But now, everything had changed. The officer's breathing became faster as the FBI agent, still calm, spoke again. "You don't get to hide behind your badge anymore," the agent said firmly. "This is bigger than you." The officer froze. He couldn't believe what he had done. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. How could he explain his actions now? He had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. The general took a step forward. His face was serious, his eyes full of strength. "You attacked me because of my uniform?" he asked, his voice steady. "Because of my race?" The officer started to speak, but was stopped by the FBI agent's hard look. "You made a huge mistake," the agent said coldly. "You picked the wrong person." The general stayed calm. "I wasn't looking for trouble," he said. "I was just walking. But you decided to make this something bigger. And now, look where we are." The officer stayed silent, feeling shame. The general had not only been a soldier, but also a hero, someone who had served his country, and the officer had treated him like nothing. "You didn't see who I really am," the general said. "You didn't see the years of service, the sacrifices. You saw a person to hurt, not a person who's worked to protect this country." The officer could barely speak. The weight of what he had done hit him hard. He had been blind to the man in front of him. He didn't see the person with honor and duty, just someone he thought was weak. Now, it was all too clear. "You're right," the officer said quietly, his voice shaking. "I didn't see who you were." The FBI agent nodded and looked at the officer. "This is not just about being a bad cop anymore," he said. "It's about a much bigger issue, a problem that goes deep." The officer wanted to argue, but he knew there was no point. The general and the FBI agent were not going to let this go. They would make sure the truth came out, and the officer would face the consequences of his actions. "You've only started to face what's coming," the general said, his voice quiet but strong. "This fight is bigger than this moment." The general turned and walked away, signaling the end of the conversation. The officer stood there, lost. He felt the weight of his mistake, realizing he had hurt someone who had given so much to his country. He was filled with regret and fear of what was next. The FBI agent stayed by the officer, making it clear that there would be no escape. The officer would be held accountable, and the general would not be ignored. The truth would come out, and justice would be done. The officer stood frozen, his heart racing. He had just tried to push around a man he thought was weak, someone he believed he could control with his badge. But he was wrong. Very wrong. The man in front of him wasn't just anyone. As the seconds ticked by, the officer realized his mistake. He had just attacked someone who had far more power and respect than he could have imagined. And now, it was too late to take back what he had done. The FBI agent beside him spoke in a calm yet firm voice. "You've made a big mistake today. Do you know who this man is?" The officer hesitated. "No," he said quietly, his face pale with fear. The FBI agent's voice was even colder as he continued. "This man is not just anyone. He's a war hero, a Medal of Honor winner. He served this country with more courage than you could ever understand. And you just attacked him like he was a criminal." The officer's legs felt weak as he realized what the agent had just said. The man he had just harmed wasn't just any soldier. He was a hero, a man who had risked his life for others. The officer could hardly believe it. The general, still standing strong, looked directly at the officer. "I've fought in wars, faced real danger. What you did to me today doesn't even come close to the things I've faced. You can't break me." The officer's face turned white. The man he had beaten was someone who had done so much for the country, yet he had treated him like nothing. The shame began to sink in. The general looked him in the eyes, unshaken. "You thought you could hurt me, but all you've done is expose who you really are." The officer couldn't find the words to reply. The guilt hit him hard. He had made a huge mistake. He had hurt someone who had given everything for his country, and now the world was watching. "I don't wear this uniform for myself," the general said, his voice steady. "I wear it for my family, for my friends who didn't make it home. You have no idea what I've been through. But you think your badge means more than my service?" The officer could no longer look him in the eye. He realized, too late, that he had been foolish and disrespectful. His actions had been wrong in every way. The officer, filled with confidence and arrogance, stood over the homeless man, his hands clenched as he tore through the backpack with force. He had already dismissed the man, assuming he was just another troublemaker, another statistic. He thought he was in control of the situation, laughing under his breath as he rummaged through the bag's contents. The man stood quietly, not a word escaping from his lips, just watching as his personal items were thrown carelessly to the ground. But then the man spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "You don't know who I am," he said. The officer scoffed. "Yeah, right. I've heard all the excuses." His fingers continued to tear through the bag, throwing out more items, not realizing what was about to unfold. The man reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out a small, folded card. The officer barely glanced at it, still too absorbed in his need for control. That was until the man opened it, and the officer's eyes froze in shock. The card was an official military identification, stamped with a symbol of distinction. As the officer's gaze shifted from the card to the man's face, a cold realization swept over him. This was no homeless man. This was a decorated military general, someone who had served his country with honor, someone whose name was etched in the history of battlefields and bravery, a man whose service earned him the highest recognition, a Medal of Honor recipient. The officer's smirk faded. "Wait, you're a general?" he stammered, his words failing him. The homeless man nodded, his expression calm, unflinching, even in the face of the officer's ignorance and disrespect. Just as the tension reached its peak, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Another officer, this time an FBI agent, appeared at the scene, and his eyes immediately fixed on the ID. He knew exactly who the man was, and a deep sense of urgency washed over him. The FBI agent rushed forward, his face ashen. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, turning to the officer. "You've attacked a hero, someone who fought for this country, someone you should have respected." The officer stood still, unsure of what to do. His entire understanding of power and authority was crumbling. He had used his position to belittle a man who had been through more than he could imagine. He had thought the uniform gave him the right to treat people however he pleased. But now his mistake was clear. The general, still calm, finally spoke again. "You think this uniform gives you the right to break someone down, to assume you know what I'm worth based on what you see?" The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. His shame was suffocating. The man he had just attacked wasn't just some unknown figure. He was someone who had stood at the forefront of battle, protecting people like him. The officer's pride had led him to disregard a person's worth based on superficial judgments. The FBI agent standing behind him spoke with conviction. "This man deserves respect. He deserves to be treated with dignity. What you've done here cannot be undone." The officer, still shaken, looked at the general with a mixture of regret and disbelief. It was clear that he could never take back the actions he had taken, but the general was silent, staring back with a steady gaze that was impossible to ignore. In that moment, the officer realized just how wrong he had been. This was a man who had earned the right to wear that uniform, who had put his life on the line for the freedom others took for granted. The general wasn't just some homeless man, and the officer was forced to confront the fact that his assumptions were rooted in ignorance and prejudice. "Your actions have consequences," the FBI agent added, looking at the officer one last time. "You'll have to live with what you've done." The officer didn't reply. He could only stand there, humiliated, as the FBI agent turned his attention back to the general. "Thank you for your service," the agent said quietly, a deep sense of respect in his voice. This never should have happened. As the scene drew to a close, the officer's role in the situation became painfully clear. He had taken his authority too far, assuming that his uniform gave him the right to abuse those he deemed beneath him. But in the end, it was the man in front of him who taught him a valuable lesson. Always remember that respect isn't granted based on outward appearances or titles. True strength lies in recognizing the worth of others, regardless of their situation. Judging others based on superficial traits only leads to mistakes and regret. And sometimes, karma catches up when you least expect it.